Welcome, everyone. Hi, Laura. You ready?
Good morning. Yep. Ready?
Good.
Looking forward to it.
Hi, Noah.
Hi.
I have just, Daniel was on 4 minutes ago, and we tested his slides, and then he's coming back in a few minutes.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
Excellent.
but the slides are good. He is ready.
Excellent. So everything is good. And thank you, Laura, for making the introductions.
You're welcome. I'm happy to do it.
Great. So I'll be back when I hear some sounds coming up.
Yeah, go ahead. Everyone will start in 10 minutes. Welcome, everyone. Hi, Kara. Welcome, everyone.
Hi.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. I think Peter is trying to speak, but we couldn't hear you because you were muted.
Thank you, Noah.
Mhm.
Appreciate that. I actually
Yeah.
just wanted to make sure that my microphone was working in terms of hearing. So thank you.
Yeah, great.
We'll start in about 5 minutes. Thanks to everyone for coming today.
Hey, I'm back.
Great. The room is filling up.
Good.
And for everyone on the call, we're recording this today.
It's great to see you, Dan.
Hi, how are you? No,
I'm good.
good to see you.
Yep. I'm streaming from San Diego for the
Ah.
Society of Neuroscience. So I was gonna
Good for you.
offer everyone some view.
Nice and early.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow, beautiful.
You got the best room in the house.
Well, there's many of those, but yeah, they all have very similar view.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's very nice. It's kind of like a picture rather than a window, and so it's really pretty.
And it's not too early, given that you're
Yeah.
coming from the
Ex-
east.
Exactly. And it doesn't conflict with the conference, but I don't need to give up anything.
Perfect.
Yep. But I'm really excited that to hear that the others that Wayne get to hear of your work.
Have you been to the any of the events at the meeting yet? Is it
Yeah. The meeting, it's actually the
started
day
over the
before
weekend?
last.
Yeah,
So it was Saturday. It usually runs Saturday afternoon through Wednesday.
right. Is the
Yeah.
attendance, live attendance, what it normally is, or?
So it crept. I went up over the years. I think it cut down to about 2/3, between half and 2/3. So there's like 22. The numbers, updated numbers were, I think, on Monday. So this is probably the max of it. 22,000. It used to be 36. I think it
Right.
got close to 40. So yeah, it's more spread out. There's no, you don't get compressed with the people as you try to go through the hallways. These posters, they only go to the double digits, to the XXVV. There's no WWW anymore. So
Yeah.
so it's smaller, but still a lot of people, of course. Yeah.
There's some benefits because it can be so overwhelming. You know,
Mhm.
I go once every few years, but it can be overwhelming with the amount of people there. So there's some benefits to a little smaller crowd.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can actually, there's not that many competing talk sessions. So you don't need to run too much between. It's kind of, I think there's changed it a bit. It's more thematically, the talks are kind of more thematically organized. So it's easy to stay in a session throughout the whole time, the nano symposium, as they call it. But yeah, it's fun.
Mhm.
Well, the room is filling up. I will start in a minute or two. I want to just tell everyone you're going to be recorded. And thank you for coming this morning. All right, we'll get started so some people can join. So I want to welcome everyone to the third talk of the IOG colloquium series for this fall. We're lucky to have Dr. Daniel Schacter. And Laura Sutherland, our doctoral student in social work and anthropology, has prepared an introduction for him, about him. So I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Good morning, everyone. I would like to offer a warm Institute of Gerontology welcome to Dr. Daniel Schacter. Dr. Schacter is William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Psychology at Harvard University and a prior chair of their Department of Psychology. He is also the PI for the Schacter Memory Lab at Harvard, focused on understanding the nature and function of human memory. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and his PhD from the University of Toronto. After graduating, he remained at Toronto until joining the University of Arizona in 1987 and has been at Harvard University since 1991. Dr. Schacter has won many awards in his field, including being elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as the National Academy of Sciences. His many books include Searching for Memory from 1996 and The 7 Sins of Memory from 2001, the 20th anniversary of edition of which was recently released, both named as New York Times Notable Books of the Year and winners of the American Psychological Association's William James Book Award. In addition, he and his many collaborators have published over 450 articles and chapters. His research interests include unconscious and conscious forms of memory, cognitive neuroscience of memory, memory distortions, imagination, future thinking, creativity, and the effect of aging on memory. Today, Dr. Schacter is here to discuss how episodic memory plays a role in a broad range of cognitive functions, with his talk entitled Contributions of Episodic Memory to Imagination, Problem Solving, and Creativity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schacter today.
Right, let me just get my slides up. Hopefully everyone can see those. Great. Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about some of the work that we've been doing really over the past 10 to 15 years on the contributions of episodic memory problem solving to imagination problem solving and creativity. And I will be emphasizing a lot of the work that we've done on aging on this topic over the past decade. So it's a pleasure to be talking to an Institute of Gerontology. And also I have to mention the institution where my daughter is now an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. She would probably be here, except she's too busy with a 6-month-old who takes up all of her time nowadays. But you'll be seeing her again soon. Okay, so the work I'm going to be talking about is, as I said, really mostly the past decade and even more recent, but the roots of it go back a long time to when I was at the University of Toronto in the early 1980s, running a lab that we called the Unit for Memory Disorders, where we studied a lot of patients with brain damage and severe memory problems. And the most interesting of those, I would say, that I ever knew was someone who's fairly well known in the neuropsychological literature, amnesic patient KC. KC had a head injury, I think it was 1981, 1982, that resulted in mostly in severe memory problems. He could not remember a single event that had occurred to him in his past. So it was a more or less complete inability to remember past episodes, a devastating impairment of episodic memory with some preservation of other kinds of memory, such as semantic memory, implicit memory. We did a lot of priming studies with KC back in the 1980s, showing that he could exhibit the non-conscious influences of performance on his non-conscious influences of past experience on his current performance. But the relevant observations that I want to talk about today come from a session in which Endel Tulving, who had been my PhD mentor and with whom I continued to do some work when I was at the University of Memory Disorders, Endel Tulving and I were interviewing KC about his memory loss. And KC at that time looked like the picture on the left. The picture on the right is one from a few years back, and then sadly he passed away shortly after that. But in this testing session, Tulving asked him some questions about his personal past, and then the relevant observations here, which I'm extracting this brief excerpt from an article Tulving published in Canadian Psychology, where he shows part of this interview. KC is referred to here by the initials NN. He was referred to by a variety of different initials. But Tulving asked him about past events. Of course, he could not remember any past events. Then he started asking him a seemingly innocent question: what will you be doing tomorrow? So here he says, let's try the question again about the future. What will you be doing tomorrow? The patient smiles faintly, then says, I don't know. Do you remember the question? KC had intact short-term memory, so he could remember that. He'd say, yeah, about what I'll be doing tomorrow. Yes, how would you describe your state of mind when you try to think about it? Blank, I guess. That was really striking to us because we knew KC couldn't remember a single event from his past, but what we're seeing here is that he couldn't even imagine events that might occur in his future. And given his severe problems with episodic memory, that suggested a possible role for episodic memory, not only in thinking back to the past, but also imagining to the future. That observation stuck with me for a long time, but as a memory researcher, I had a good idea about how to study memory for past events, but I didn't really know how to study imagining future events. And so really didn't do anything about that for a couple of decades, even though I thought about it a lot in the back of my mind. Tulving wrote a little bit about this issue, but never really did any experimental work on it. Well, that all changed in 2006 when a new postdoc arrived in my lab, Donna Rosetta, shown in the picture in this slide. She had been doing some work on fMRI of autobiographical memory, and we began talking about how we could adapt some of her paradigms to look at fMRI activity, brain activity, when people are imagining into the future. Again, motivated by some of those early observations regarding patient KC. So we developed this very simple paradigm shown in a cartoon here from an article we wrote in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, That shows the essence of the paradigm. Participants would be put into the fMRI scanner, and they would be shown a cue word and asked to either remember a past event related to that word or imagine a future event related to that word. So here you see the thought bubble for the participant on the right. I imagine picking out a puppy at the pet shop next year. That would be in response to a cue word such as dog, and instructions to imagine some event that the participant might be involved in involving a dog over the next couple of years. And in the left thought bubble, you can see the participant thinking, I remember taking a day trip last summer and walking on the beach. That might be in response to a cue word such as vacation, and instructions to remember an event related to vacation for the past few years. So we compared brain activity in those two conditions to one another and to a control condition where people were given cue words and given a cognitive task that didn't involve remembering or imagining a specific event. And what happened was very striking, is that when we compared brain activity, when people remember the past or imagine the future to control conditions, what we saw was very strikingly similar activity for past and future events. Here I'm showing you activation in a couple of midline regions, the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, retrosplenial areas that activated strongly and indistinguishably for past and future events. We also saw several other regions, including the hippocampus, of course, a region known to be involved in memory, activating similarly for past and future events. And on the basis of that study and the one or two other studies, related studies that were available at the time, in 2007, we published this review in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, where we postulated the existence of what we called a core network involved in remembering past events, imagining future events, and related kinds of mental simulations involving those two midline regions that I just talked about, as well as the medial temporal lobe, of course, including the hippocampus, and lateral temporal and lateral parietal regions. The cognitive neuroscientists in the group will recognize that this core network overlaps greatly with what we know as the default mode network. It's pretty much is the default mode network with a couple of small differences. We only had a couple of studies to go on at the time. Shortly after 2007, there was a lot of activity in this area. A lot of people started doing this kind of work. And then in a larger, in a meta-analysis led by Roland Benoit, who was a postdoc in my lab at the time, we saw that this same joint activation for episodic simulation, imagining future events or other kinds of hypothetical events, showed similar increased activity in a variety of fMRI studies as episodic memory. So it seemed to be a fairly general observation. We also started doing some work on aging at the time. At the same time as we were doing that initial fMRI study that we published back in 2007, we were conducting a behavioral study with older adults. We knew at the time that older adults tend to remember past events with less episodic detail with young adults, and we wondered, would this pattern extend to imagined future events? So our first study on this, published back in 2008, Psych Science, involved 16 younger adults, 16 older adults, and generally high-functioning older adults of the kind that we typically enroll in our cognitive aging studies. And we adapted a well-known procedure in cognitive psychology and neuropsychology that had been developed in 2002 by Brian Levine and his colleagues, known as the autobiographical interview. And we adapted it to be used not only for remembering past events, but also for imagining future events. So there were 4 critical events in each condition where participants would be cued with a word, a noun such as shoe, and asked to recall or imagine in as much detail as they could an event from the past few weeks, the past few years in the memory condition, or the next few weeks or next few years in the future imagining condition. They would date the event, rate it for various attributes. And the critical thing here is that details, this is really the critical feature of the autobiographical interview, are classified as either internal, Those are episodic details, specifics of the event. So if somebody remembered going, for example, in response to shoe, if they remembered going to a shoe store and the salesperson went and got them some sneakers, those would be core aspects of the event, and they'd be coded as internal details. If someone started saying, you know, I really like that kind of sneaker, I've always worn it in the past, those would be coded as external details, semantic information, related facts, commentary. So that's an important way in which the autobiographical interview divides up the content that people provide when they remember a past event or imagine a future event into episodic details. Those are internal details, and then external details, which are, again, kind of a compilation of semantic information, related facts, commentary, and so forth. And we get very reliable scoring from scorers who are blind to whether to the protocols. You get 0.9 agreement about whether a particular detail is internal or external. And that's important for a lot of what I'm about to say. So what happened? Well, if we look at the past events, that's the memory condition. What we can see is older adults remembered fewer past events with fewer internal details than did younger adults, and more external details. So that is basically replicating what Levine and colleagues had shown previously. The new finding from this study was that the same pattern holds when older adults imagine into the future. They're imagining future events with fewer internal or episodic details, and they're providing more of these external details, facts, commentary, and the like. Those kinds of findings led us, the aging findings, the imaging findings, and the amnesia findings, to suggest that episodic memory, which of course is traditionally associated with recollection of past personal experiences, plays a key role in imagining possible future scenarios, which we often refer to as episodic simulation. And it does so by supporting the flexible retrieval and recombination of elements of stored episodes to construct possible future episodes. So this process, we argued, of flexible recombination, taking bits and pieces of past events and recombining them to imagine a novel event in the future, is a very adaptive use of episodic memory, because the future, after all, is rarely identical to the past. So we need to be able to simulate novel situations based on past experience. And our main argument was that we can use our episodic memories in this very flexible way, recombine details to imagine novel events that can occur to us in the future. But we also argued that the same flexible recombination process can result in memory errors when elements of past experiences are miscombined. So our basic argument was that this flexible use of episodic memory for purposes of simulating the future might also lead to certain kinds of memory errors. I'm not going to talk much about that today, but if I have a couple of minutes at the end of the talk, I'll come back to that point about the link to memory errors. All right, so the similarities that I've described between remembering the past and imagining the future apply a role for episodic retrieval in imagination and future thinking, hence our term episodic simulation. But these observations, it turned out, didn't provide conclusive evidence that episodic retrieval is critically involved, and the key evidence came from a follow-up study on aging. So in this follow-up study, we replicated the findings I just told you about on age-related reductions in episodic detail for past and future events, but we observed a similar aging effect on a picture description test, where participants simply have to describe what's in a picture that is presented to them. No episodic memory should be involved. And older adults will provide fewer what we called internal details about what you actually see in the picture, and more external details, more commentary, reflection, reference to unrelated events. So that suggested the possibility that the age-related reductions in episodic detail for past and future events that we saw in the original study, the 2008 study, might actually reflect something much more broad. the influence of non-episodic factors such as descriptive or narrative abilities that change with age. Older adults might just talk about their experiences differently than younger adults in the past and future, but also in the present. So maybe it's not so much a episodic memory issue as it is a question of changes in narrative ability, at least with respect to the aging data. And indeed, we did an fMRI study that was published back in 2011 that showed that older adults, when they remember the past, imagine the future, and show increased activation of regions associated with conceptual processing, which might reflect some of these changes in general narrative ability that I referred to earlier. So these observations with aging really drove us to ask the question, how can we provide a stronger test of the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis and distinguish between what we might think of as episodic and non-episodic influences on these memory and imagination tasks? We've got to be able to pull the two apart if we want to be able to draw clear conclusions about the role of episodic retrieval in imagining the future. So our approach has been over the past few years now to try to manipulate the involvement of episodic retrieval in imagination and other tasks that I'll get to that are not typically considered episodic memory tasks. And we've used two kinds of manipulation that I'm going to tell you about. One we call an episodic specificity induction. I'll spend a bunch of time on that, talking about that and how we've used it to look at future imagining, everyday problem solving, divergent creative thinking, and then I'll say a few words about our use of transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, to approach some of these same issues. So let's talk first about episodic specificity induction. What is that? Well, this is a procedure that was led initially in my lab by a couple of graduate students who have since moved on, Kevin Medora and Helen Jing, pictured here. And ESI refers to brief training in recollecting the details of a past experience. And for this brief training, we adapted a well-known procedure known as the cognitive interview that was developed by Fisher and Geiselman decades ago at UCLA as a forensic protocol that's been shown to increase episodic retrieval in eyewitnesses. But why are we adapting the cognitive interview? Here's the logic. What we're trying to do now is use this brief training, our adapted version of the cognitive interview, the ESI, to activate or bias episodic retrieval processes. And by doing so, our argument is that the ESI should have selective downstream consequences on subsequent tasks. It should boost performance on subsequent tasks that draw on episodic retrieval, such as future imagining, at least according to our hypothesis, and shouldn't have much of an effect, should have little or no effect on subsequent tasks that do not draw on episodic retrieval, such as describing a picture. So what we wanted to do was use this ESI procedure to possibly show that there is a distinction between the episodic processes that drive remembering the past, imagining the future, and the narrative non-episodic processes that could be involved in those tasks, as well as in the picture description test that I told you about. So let's walk through what these inductions look like. Typically what happens is people initially see a video of people carrying out everyday tasks in a kitchen. It's the one that we've used. And for the ESI, having just seen this video, they're asked to try to think back to the video, close their eyes, get a picture in their head about the people you saw. I want you to think about what they look like, what they're wearing. Once you have a really good picture, I want you to tell me everything you remember about the people in the video. Be as specific and detailed as you can. They do that for objects, actions in the video, their mental imagery probes, temporal order probes. And what we want to see is how going through this ESI impacts later performance on unrelated tasks. Well, we've got to then compare the ESI to something. So we also have a control induction. So in this condition, the same participant in a separate session would see a different version of the kitchen video. And now they'd also be asked to think back to that video, but instead of being asked for specific episodic details, they're asked to give their general impressions of the people in the video. Did you like it? When did you think it was made? We ask them about actions, their impressions of the actions, the objects, and so on. They talk about as much in the two conditions about the video, but we think that the ESI is going to have specific effects on the episodic tasks that we later give to our participants. So here are the three tasks that we used in this study. What we do is we show them pictures of everyday scenes, one at a time. I'm showing you 4 at once, but in the experiment, it's just one at a time. These are the same pictures that we used in the previous study I told you, a picture description study I told you about. So there are 3 conditions. Participants have 3 minutes to remember a past experience related to the picture. So for the picture of the beach, you might remember a vacation that you took. We think that depends on episodic memory and should be impacted by having just had the episodic specificity induction. Imagine a possible future experience related to the picture. So for the one in the lower left, picture of a shopping mall, you might imagine if you're seeing that picture, a trip you would take to your local shopping mall next month. We also think that depends on episodic retrieval and therefore should be impacted by the prior episodic specificity induction. The third task is just describe the picture. Tell me what's in that picture. So for the one in the upper right, you might say, well, there's a man dancing with a woman in a purple top, and there are a bunch of other people also dancing, so on and so forth. Tell me what's in that picture. And we don't think that has anything to do with episodic retrieval, therefore shouldn't be impacted by a prior episodic specificity induction. So we compared 24 young, 24 older adults. They all take part in both inductions, 2 sessions spaced 7 days apart. In the first session, they see the kitchen video, they get either the specificity or control induction, and then they go on to do those memory, imagination, and description tasks. They come back a week later, they see a different version of the video, they get whichever induction they didn't get in the first session, specificity or control, and go on to do memory, imagination, and description tasks with different cues than were used in different pictures than were used in session 1. And then we have our raters code these trials for internal and external details based on the autobiographical interview. So we know what that involves for memory and imagination. Internal details are the episodic details. External details are commentary, inferences, and related facts. For picture description, we slightly alter it. An internal detail is a detail that we all agree you can see in the picture, is physically, perceptually present in the picture, and external details, as in memory and imagination, are commentary, inferences, related facts that subjects mention. All right, so what happens? Let's look first at the internal details. So comparing young and older adults, what we see overall is that older adults provide fewer internal details than do the younger adults on all 3 tasks. That's what we expect from previous research. Importantly, however, you'll see that the episodic specificity induction is having a selective effect for young and old on the memory and imagination tasks. So for the young adults, after they've just had the specificity induction, they remember past events with more episodic detail than when they've just had the control induction. Same for imagining the future. For picture description, there's no difference, no effect of the ESI on describing a picture. And the same is true for older adults, albeit at a lower level. They get a boost from the ESI on memory and imagination, no effect on picture description. And then if we look at external details, what we see is the same pattern that we've seen in previous studies. Older adults provide more external details, commentary. They may be, it may be off-topic speech, something related to differences in the way they're narrating their experiences, but there's no impact of the ESI on external details. So the ESI is dissociating the retrieval of episodic details during remembering, imagining from the retrieval of non-episodic information, external details, and also dissociating performance on memory and imagination tasks from the picture description tasks. So we think that it does a really nice job of, in fact, showing that there's an episodic component shared between remembering and imagining, and you can carve that off from this non-episodic component that does impact these tasks, but is not impacted by the specificity induction. And again, that probably relates to more general narrative kind of content that people provide when talking about experiences in the past, present, and future. That led us to a prediction for an fMRI study that we expected core network regions previously implicated in episodic retrieval, including the hippocampus, would be influenced during future imagining tasks by a prior ESI. So we did that study, published it a few years ago. Very simple procedure. Subjects get either the episodic specificity induction, as I've described it, or the control induction. We don't scan the inductions, but then they're scanned when they do a future imagining task. You're given a word and asked to just imagine a personal event, or do this control task, which we've used in several fMRI studies, where you get a similar cue word, but now you have to generate what we call a size sentence, where you put in a couple of related object words and you mentally order them according to the size of the objects and define those words. So that task involves both some visuospatial processing and semantic processing, doesn't involve episodic processing. So we think it's a good control task. And the behavioral data replicated earlier work. We have found ESI selectively increasing internal details on the imagination task. If we look at the imaging results, if we ask the question, what region showed more activity after you've imagined a future event compared to the object processing control task, what you can see is that pretty much all those core network regions are activating following ESI, and also to some extent following the control induction. But even by eyeballing it, you can see, for example, in the hippocampus, there's much stronger activity during future imagining following ESI than following the control induction. And indeed, a more formal comparison showed exactly that several regions, including the left anterior hippocampus, that have been linked to episodic retrieval showed more activity when people imagine the future after having had the specificity induction versus the control induction. So we think that accords nicely with the behavioral data that I showed you a minute ago. All right, so that concludes what I'm going to say about ESI and imagining the future. Now let's look at how we applied the ESI to examining the possible role of episodic retrieval in another domain, which is known in the literature as means-end social problem solving. And this goes back to a task that Platt and Spivak developed way back in 1975 to look at this process, where your task is to try to generate steps that comprise solutions to various kinds of everyday social problems that we all encounter, handling an interpersonal situation at work, meeting people, and so forth. And some previous evidence coming from Morris Moskovich's lab suggested that people retrieve and recombine episodic details to provide solution steps. And again, the critical data here was from aging. So older adults provided fewer relevant steps than younger adults, and the deficit was correlated with reduced episodic details in autobiographical memory. So that led Kevin Medora and I to predict that the ESI should enhance problem-solving performance in both young and old adults, given that there seems to be a role for episodic retrieval in this task based on the Sheldon, McAndrews, and Moskovich study. So we had a couple of different conditions here. We used the social problems from the original Platt and Spivak paper. So this is the way they're phrased. Jay noticed that her friends seemed to be avoiding her. Jay wanted to have friends and be liked. The story ends when Jay's friends like her again. You begin the story where Jay first notices her friends are deserting her. So you start with this problem. Her friends are avoiding her, and it has a nice happy ending. How do you get from point A to point B? So a relevant step would be one that moves the protagonist toward the goal. So Jay asked one of her friends what was wrong. Yeah, that would be a good thing to do in that situation. An irrelevant step would be a step or event that moves the protagonist away from the goal. So if you said, well, Jay joined the new club to make new friends, that really wouldn't solve her problem of getting back with her friends again. And a no step would just be something that doesn't move toward or away from the goal, irrelevant information, commentary, and so forth. And we also included a separate condition involving personal goals that are judged as relevant by both young and old adults. So we would work these up to have the similar form to Platt and Spivak, but would be how can you eat better, stay mentally active, exercise more, and given to the subjects in the same form as the hypotheticals from Platt and Spivak. We had 48 young, 48 older adults. The procedure is pretty much like I told you before. You're seeing that kitchen video, getting either the episodic specificity induction or the control induction, and then you get the two different kinds of problems, the Platt and Spivak problems and the personal problems. And just as a manipulation check, we also do an autobiographical memory and future imagining test to make sure that the episodic specificity induction is working as expected, and it was. I'm not going to bother showing you those data. And then in a separate session, you get another version of the video, you get whichever induction you didn't get in the first session, and you do a different set of problems, memory and imagination. So first of all, we do replicate the finding of age-related differences in doing these means and problems. So both with the standard Platt and Spivak set, what you see is that older adults are providing fewer relevant steps to solving these problems than our younger adults. And the same is true for the self-relevant problems. There's no difference in other steps. Those don't occur very often. Critically, however, even though older adults were providing fewer relevant steps, they, like the younger adults, showed a boost in performance for both problem-solving conditions after they've had the episodic specificity induction compared to the control induction. It's not a huge effect, one or two more steps that they provide, but it is significant. We went on in this line of work to do some related studies on the role of episodic retrieval in worrisome future events. So we know that worry about possible future experiences can be detrimental to psychological well-being. That's no surprise. And so in this study led by Helen Jing, we tried to manipulate the amount of simulation detail when people are imagining how they would deal with worrisome future events with the ESI to see whether increased episodic detail produces the same kind of increased episodic detail from the ESI produces the same kind of benefit in problem solving that we just saw for a kind of a standard MEPS task, and also in emotion regulation in their affect toward this worrisome event. So the first study was done with college students. They'd come into the lab, they'd list 30 specific concrete problems or events that are highly worrisome. So for a college student, not surprisingly, something like, I'm worried about doing poorly on the final for my psychology class because that would bring down my GPA. We were concerned, would they be able to come up with 30 worrisome events? And they had no problem doing that. Our students do have a lot of things they're worried about. So that would be the part of the first task. We'd also, ask them, what's the positive outcome you hope will happen for this event? I get an A on the exam. What's the negative outcome you fear will happen? I fail the final and it brings down my grade in the class. So then we collected those events, and then we converted what they gave us into the form typical for the MEPS test, the means and problem solving test. So they get these personal problem stories. You would like to do well on your upcoming psychology final. The story begins with you worrying about your psychology final. The story ends with you getting an A on your psychology final. Please fill in the middle of the story. So how are you going to get from worrying about the exam to getting an A on the exam, to doing well on it? And they have 5 minutes to generate steps to reach a positive outcome for each of these personal problem stories. And what we found here is that, once again, just like with the standard MEPS test I told you about, we get a nice boost following the episodic specificity induction in relevant steps that these students provide young adults provide to solve their personal problem with no impact on other steps. So it's not just increasing verbal output, it seems to be selectively targeting their ability to generate steps that are relevant to solving their problem. And participants also showed greater decreases in negative affect toward the worrisome event after the ESI. So they felt better about this worrisome event, suggesting that generating these more detailed episodic simulations can enhance emotion regulation and aspects of well-being. Well, we wanted to see, would this extend to older adults? So one of our more recent studies on this was published in the journal Emotion in 2020. We try to extend this to older adults. We had some success with it. I'll briefly summarize the study. So I'm not going to go into all the details, but it's the same kind of setup as before with the ESI versus a control induction. We asked the older adults to tell us about worrisome events in an initial session. Then they get the ESI or the control induction, and then they do the personalized version of the means and problem solving task focused on their worrisome event. And once again, we find a nice increase in the number of relevant steps now that older adults are able to come up with towards solving their worrisome problem. But we didn't see in this study any greater decreases in negative affect toward the worrisome event after ESI, suggesting perhaps there's some limits of the ESI in older adults. We then went on and we did a second experiment where we compared the personalized MEPS task without any inductions to a more semantically oriented advice task, how a friend should deal with a worrisome problem. And we wanted to see whether engaging in whatever amount of episodic retrieval they do on the personalized MEPS task without any prior induction, whether that would produce, compared to a semantic task, changes in emotion regulation. And indeed, that's what we found. So just doing the MEPS task was sufficient to allow them to generate more relevant steps than doing this more semantic task. And right, where am I? Here I am. Yeah, sorry, I was one slide off there. This shows that, again, we get the effect in relevant steps. There are more relevant steps, more internal details. We code for those for the personal MEPS task versus the advice task. But the critical new finding here was that indeed older adults showed greater decreases in negative affect toward the worrisome event after the personal MEPS task than after the advice task, indicating that increasing episodic retrieval in this way, compared to a semantically oriented task at least, can produce enhanced emotion regulation in older adults, even though they didn't get some extra benefit in the other experiment from having a prior episodic specificity induction. All right, now I want to move on to my third domain, where we see a role for episodic retrieval, and this has to do with divergent creative thinking. So there's been some evidence suggesting that episodic retrieval might contribute to divergent thinking, which Guilford defined over 50 years ago as the ability to generate creative ideas by combining diverse types of information in novel ways. And one way in which this has been shown is that on the alternate uses task, this is a standard test of divergent thinking that I'm going to go into in more detail in a minute, where you have to generate novel uses for common objects, that the number of generated novel uses is positively correlated with the number of episodic details in people's future simulations. These are two studies from my lab that have shown that in different ways. We know that AUT performance engages core network regions from some work by fMRI work by Benedict and colleagues. And there's also some evidence that amnesic patients with MTL damage are impaired on divergent thinking tasks. So all of that suggested that our episodic specificity induction should impact divergent creative thinking if indeed there is some role for episodic retrieval in that task. So we did a study very similar to the one that ones I've told you about so far, same kind of setup. This is just with young adults. You get a video, ESI or control induction, And then you get either the AUT, I'll go into that in a minute, or an object association task. And you come back a week later and you see a different video, get whichever induction you didn't get in the first session, and you do different versions of the AUT and object association tasks. Let's go into what the tasks are. So for the alternate uses task, you're trying to generate unusual and creative uses for 5 different everyday objects, such as a coin. And you score it for total uses that people come up with, appropriate uses, whether it could actually work, because it's supposed to be novel but appropriate, category of uses, uses that fit under one category, and categories of appropriate uses, uses that fit under one category that are also appropriate. And that's generally the measure that most people rely on the most. It's known as the flexibility measure for the AUT. So what exactly do I mean here? So for example, for coin, using as a board game piece and as a board, as a bingo chip, are appropriate uses under one category of games. So you'd only get credit for one category of appropriate uses, because you're not going to get category, credit for every single game use that you can think of for a coin. For a shoe, holding an adult in it and holding a big screen TV in it are inappropriate uses under one category of holding, so you wouldn't get credit because that couldn't actually work. All right, and for the object association task, you're getting the same kinds of cues, but you're just coming up with objects that are typically associated with that cue instead of generating novel uses. That's the control task. So what did we find? We found that the specificity induction had a significant impact on that flexibility measure of the AUT that I told you about. So after you've just had the specificity induction, you're generating a few more novel and appropriate uses of the object than after you've had the control induction, and we don't see any effect of the specificity induction on the object association task. So once again, there's a nice selective impact of ESI on the task that we think involves episodic retrieval. And we replicated these findings with older adults in a subsequent study I won't have time to go into. I'll also mention that we replicated the behavioral findings, reported increased activation of the hippocampus following ESI in an fMRI study of divergent thinking published a couple of years ago. And more recently, for anyone who's interested, we tried to extend this to a creative writing task. Would the ESI impact how people approach writing a creative story? And in this study, just with younger adults published recently in Creativity Research Journal, we found at least suggestive evidence that is the case. All right, so that's all I want to say about ESI, and I just want to take my final few minutes to say a few words about how we've used TMS to provide kind of converging evidence on the kinds of findings that I've just told you about with ESI. So as most of you probably know, TMS is an attempt to create a temporary lesion in healthy individuals. And you do that by applying a magnet to a specific point on the skull. And the TMS pulse directly alters neural activity in a spherical area of approximately 1 centimeter cube. So that's where the direct effects are in that selective area. As we'll see, there are more downstream effects that we can also exploit. So in our first study, this is led by Preston Thackrell, published a few years ago, we gave inhibitory TMS to the left angular gyrus. That's a part of the core network on the surface in the parietal lobe, on the near the cortical surface, that we think is involved in episodic retrieval. And Preston's study showed that after you've applied TMS to this region, there's a similar reduction in episodic details when people later remember past events and imagine future events in response to word cues, the same kind of tasks that I've just been telling you about, scored with the autobiographical interview, while having no effect. Applying TMS to the left angular gyrus doesn't have any effect on non-episodic details or on a semantic free association task. And of course, we're comparing these TMS effects from the left angular gyrus to a TMS control region at the vertex. That's a region that we think has nothing to do with episodic retrieval. So all of these effects of applying TMS to the left angular gyrus are relative to, compared with the control condition where you're applying TMS to the vertex, a region we think has nothing to do with episodic retrieval. Now, we know that application of the TMS to the angular gyrus also impacts connected regions. That came from an important study from Joel Voss's lab back in 2014, showing that if you apply TMS to the left angular gyrus, it can have an impact on regions that are connected to the left angular gyrus. One of those regions, Voss's lab showed in the Wang et al. Study, is the hippocampus. So in fact, you can apply TMS to the left angular gyrus and potentially impact activity downstream in the hippocampus, but you have to do fMRI to see whether that's actually happening. So in this study, we used fMRI-guided TMS to the left angular gyrus, again, compared with the vertex control to try to modulate the hippocampus during both episodic simulation of a future event, as I've been telling you about, and also on a divergent thinking task. We reported this in a paper in PNAS in 2020. And in separate sessions, TMS was applied either to the AG or the vertex control site just prior to task performance. So they then do the task during fMRI scanning. We don't scan when TMS is applied. They either generated alternate uses or performed a sentence control task. So word cues, that should say coin up there, not COI, were presented during scanning, and they did the imagine a future event related to a coin, generate an alternate use of coin, or do the sentence generation control task that I told you about before. So what happened? Oh, and of course, details of imagined events coded by the autobiographical interview into internal and external for the imagination condition. And we scored AUT performance just for raw fluency, the number of novel and appropriate uses, and also flexibility that I told you about earlier, categories of novel and appropriate uses. And what we found is that in terms of the behavioral performance, we had a nice replication and extension of our previous findings. So applying TMS to the angular gyrus reduces the number of internal details in your episodic future simulations. That's this left uppermost bar, and has no impact on control internal details or external details in either task. And new behavioral data here showed that applying TMS to the angular gyrus compared to the vertex reduces both fluency and flexibility significantly. So they're behaving just like future imagining. What happens in the brain? Well, indeed, there were key hippocampal regions that showed interaction between the task and the TMS site. So you get reduced activity in the hippocampus after angular gyrus stimulation when you're doing the episodic future simulation task and the alternate uses task. But if anything, it goes the other way during the control task. So it looks like indeed we are having an impact on the hippocampus that it turns out to be, and it's also related to behavioral performance, as other analyses show. So we think these TMS and ESI behavioral and fMRI studies together implicate episodic retrieval pretty clearly in imagining future experiences and divergent creative thinking. So I think the main takeaway from this work is that episodic memory retrieval isn't just about remembering past experiences for either young or adults. It's showing up in imagining the future, trying to solve everyday problems, and even in thinking creatively. Now, my last 2 minutes, I just want to go back to this point that I mentioned earlier about flexible recombination resulting in memory errors when elements of past experiences are miscombined. We didn't have any evidence on that point when we made this kind of theoretical conjecture, I guess you could call it. But over the past few years now, evidence has started to mount that there really is something to this, linking flexible recombination and memory errors. So there's a very neat study from Dewhurst and colleagues published a few years ago using the well-known DRM or D. Schroeder-McDermott false memory paradigm. That's where you hear a bunch of words related to sleep, and then you falsely remember having heard sleep when in fact all you heard was a bunch of related words. They show that when you imagine future scenarios, when you're presented one of these lists, it in fact increases false memories in the DRM paradigm, I think broadly consistent with what we argued in that 2007 paper. From my own lab, we've gone in a slightly different direction. These are complicated studies I won't have the time to get into. Work that was led by Alexis Carpenter, showing that flexible recombination processes that in these experiments led to successful inferences regarding the association between people in distinct but related episodes. So imagine you're taking a walk in your neighborhood and you see an older woman with a dog. The next day you're taking the same walk and you see a man of the same age with the same dog. If you link those two episodes together, you can make the inference that those two people are related in some way. So we have an experimental paradigm that looks at that. And what we find is that when people are successful in doing that, there also is an increase in memory errors. For example, mixing up, getting wrong where you saw the man and where you saw the woman. You saw them in different parts of the neighborhood. And if you successfully link those things together, these studies show you're more likely to make a source memory error, which we attribute to this kind of flexible recombination process. And we've done some fMRI studies that illuminate the neural correlates of that finding. Interestingly, and surprisingly to us, we didn't see these increases in source memory errors following successful associative inference in older adults. We report this in a Psychology and Aging paper, maybe because of age-related deficits in associative binding that we discuss in the paper. So for those who are interested in following up more on the memory errors angle, I'll just say, close with pointing out two things. One, I can't resist plugging the 20th anniversary edition of the book that was kindly mentioned in the introduction on the 7 Sins of Memory. I talk about some of this work in that recent edition. And also, prospectively, I've recently written an article for the Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition. It was a target article that the editor invited me to write about what kind of progress have we seen in understanding the various memory sins in applied settings over the past 2 decades. So that's going to come out next month with 6 commentaries from a variety of memory researchers. So it looks like it's shaping up to be an interesting issue. I've seen the commentaries and I think they're quite good. All right, well, so that concludes what I have to say. I just want to acknowledge my funding sources, my lab and collaborators, and thanks for hanging in there with me over Zoom.
Thank you so much. Wonderful talk, Dr. Schacter. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions, if anyone has one.
I'm happy to, if nobody. Thank you so much. It has been such a wonderful overview and really exciting, and it's really nice to see how everything links together and progresses. My question is kind of small and maybe somewhat technical, but maybe has some implication. In your designs that are very elegant, you bring them twice and you kind of have the episodic induction either the first or the second. How do you know that they are kind of naive when they come the second time and now they're inside the control, but they already kind of have those strategies? And related to this, if they are naive, then that task doesn't have lingering transfer long-term effects. So those are the big.
That's a great question. And it's something we worried about when we first started on this line of research. Should we go with a between subjects design where some people get control, some people get ESI, or take our chances with the within subjects design, but then risking what you said, possible carryover of one task to another? So because in general, if you're brought up as an experimental psychologist, you always want to go with the within subjects design if at all possible. We tried that and we figured, well, let's separate the task by a week. And if there's carryover effect, it would work against our hypothesis. So as you state correctly, if there are lingering effects from having that ESI, they come back the next week, maybe they bring some of that to the second task. Well, that would work against finding any difference between the two tasks. And so because we do find a difference, we infer that there's no lingering effect. Now, the downside of that, of course, is that suggests that this is a very short-lasting effect. In fact, we were initially just cautious about even trying to do 2 sessions within the same lab session, but then we brought the procedure into the scanner. Well, we had to do it right away, and even then we found that there was no carryover. So we counterbalanced whether you got ESI or control first in the scanner, and there was no carryover effect that we could detect. So what's going on? Well, what we think the ESI is, it's like a short-term change in your retrieval orientation, where you're really focused on looking for episodic details. But it's very easy to break that retrieval orientation once you go into another task set. There are various people who have been trying to use this and related approaches to impact depression and episodic performance for depressed individuals and older adults as well. And I think the way to try to address this is to probably use repeated procedures, because it is a very brief effect, which is nice for us as experimenters, but limits the real world utility of it. And of course, our goal here is to use it as an experimental tool. And it would be nice if we could also have practical implications, but at least in our hands, it would be very limited because it's a really short lasting effect.
Yeah, but it's really beautiful that it works, how it works. Great, thank you.
And again, I think we will thank our speaker one last time. It's fantastic to hear about this great work for so many decades. And again, I put in the chat that the next colloquium is going to be on November 29th. I will be speaking on aging with hemophilia. And also we have a student session after with Dr. Schacter. So again, thanks to everyone who came for today's colloquia, and a round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you.
So I'm hoping that I'm going to stop recording also. And I'm hoping that